Welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick, a topic that's been very popular in the news lately. I mean, I've seen it everywhere from the paranoias of the zero hedges of the world to even mainstream sources such as Tucker Carlson on Fox News marching onto the bandwagon for this hype that I'm going to discuss here. And that is the idea of global food shortages, and particularly food shortages that are going to be so bad in the United States that people are going to starve, and the grocery stores are going to be completely empty because there's just not enough food being produced because of what's going on in geopolitically and in the commodities market in general. However, if you look at it in any sort of objective manner, this is patently not true. And in the rest of this video, I'm going to debunk the great global food shortage myth. So, according to the United Nations, the definition of a food shortage is when food supplies within a bounded region do not provide the energy and nutrients needed by that region's population. Simple as that. And that is in any developed country in the world, and especially in the United States, that is not true. There is plenty of supply for food. It is true that we have inventories at 5-year lows. And because of that, we have higher prices. High prices go up when demand with grains, at least, is fairly constant because people's appetite doesn't change that much year over year. I mean, there could be nutrition or health trends. Like wheat kind of struggled during the gluten-free craze, and corn had a little bit of a boost when ethanol started to get added in. But there really isn't a lack of available grains, and therefore a lack of available meat because there'll be plenty of grains to be fed at the animals. And that's the thing. Actually, most grains, particularly corn and soybean, aren't even used for human consumption. They are used to either feed animals or they are used for industrial uses, most notably ethanol corn, which is by far the most dominant use of corn in the United States. And look, well, the reason for these concerns are that Ukraine is a significant portion of the global grain production. Its wheat exports in Ukraine and Russia combined are about 25% of the total wheat crop that is shipped overseas. And with corn, Russia is only about 1% of corn, but Ukraine is 13.2% of the world's corn crop. So, yeah, the risk of a war cutting this supply off is very scary. And you see other variables such as food prices already being in an uptrend before this. And fertilizer prices going up 170% from January 2021 to December 2021. And then during the pandemic, you saw grocery stores having a harder time filling their shelves. But the thing is that even with all this things that I mentioned that sound kind of scary, we're nowhere close to a food crisis. And there's a few reasons why. First, let's just start with the whole grocery store stocking thing with the pandemic. In natural disasters such as hurricanes or global pandemics, the reason why there's not food being stocked on the shelves is not because simply there is a lack of food in the entire world. I mean, in biblical times, famines often succeeded plagues, which was the old-timey biblical word for a pandemic, was because the people who would be working in the fields farming the food died from the plague. But the death rate was quite low for this recent pandemic. And on top of that, the farmers really were not stopped for work in a material way for most of the time during the pandemic. So that's not the reason. There was a temporary disruption where a lot of people were just out of fear, just stayed at home, and you had some economic incentives paying people who would otherwise be working in the agriculture industry to stay at home. And that's what, and more importantly, delivering the food is the hard part. Like, no truck driver wants to drive into a grocery store during a hurricane for their own safety. And that is precisely what happened when it comes to the pandemic. There was just a shortage of people to deliver the food from the farms once it was harvested, whether it's due to concerns of health related issues, or was it the fact that there was a shortage of workers due to government policy having people not working or allowing for early retirements. So that is why you had the grocery store shortages back then. It wasn't due to the running out of food. It was just due to the distribution of food being hampered by external circumstances. And speaking of transportation energy costs are a much larger portion of food costs than you think. Like, if you buy a box of cereal, the grains itself, the cost of that is well under half of the cost of your food. It's probably under 20%. I don't know the exact numbers. Most of the cost is in the packaging and the shipping and paying all the salaries of all the people who work in the food distribution and food manufacturing company. Those costs are not directly affected by the price of wheat or the price of corn. So in a developed country, the actual grain component in terms of food costs is smaller than you'd think. Same with meat. It's a little bit higher actually in the percentage of meat costs, because feed is the most biggest marginal cost for meat production. So it actually does impact it that way. And so that's kind of explains that side of it. But the other reason why I'm also not really that concerned when it comes to a food shortage in the long term, at least, and I think prices can keep going higher due to a lot of other variables. And I'm not going to go into my commodity price outlook. But even if things are trading at a higher price, there will still be full shelves at the grocery store. The supply of food is stocked for months of inventory in advance. And we are down to, in some grains, low as 3.5 to 4 months of excess supply. And that is concerning. But that it means that we're also nowhere near being out of food. And a grain growing crop cycle is about 6 months. So that can be made up by more grain being grown in the future. And with prices as high as they are in the futures market, farmers are going to be heavily incentivized to grow more, even with higher fertilizer costs. If prices are high enough, it's still well over the cost of production right now to grow grains. And historically, grains trade at the cost of production because governments subsidize production at values well over what would be the equilibrium point. And the reason they do that is for food security. Governments have their issues, but they are knowledgeable enough to know that food shortages are very destabilizing to the state. And so that is why most countries in the world have some sort of farm subsidy programs to grow well over the needed amount to keep food prices stable and to keep food supply available so that nobody is starving. And with corn, most of corn's use is for ethanol. So if there was really a food shortage in corn, for example, the U.S. government would have already responded with two things. And several of the world governments would do similar things. It would be one, export controls. If you really are low on something and you need to have as much of it as possible because you're afraid of running out, a government will respond by simply just banning the export of it. If anything, grain exports to the U.S. have increased since the start of the Ukrainian conflict. Not decreased. The only country really to ban food exports at this point that I know of, and correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, is Hungary. And the rest of the world, you have not seen any sort of banning of food exports. I mean, Russia too has restricted it, sending it to Western allies, and not entirely, but partially banned. Is more of a political retaliatory move. It's not because they're running out of food. And then the other thing too is Russia is a sizable portion of grain exports, but that's not losing all of Russia's grain production. Is not coming off the market. A lot of it is used for domestic consumption, first of all, and that's not going to change. The second is similar to what has happened with Iran and oil. Iranian oil may be sanctioned and technically illegal to sell, but there are black market ways that they get it out of the market, and there are buyers who are going to be willing to buy that oil in exchange for a lower price. And so the sanctions still do hurt Iran because they lose money from not being able to sell their oil on the open market and have to sell it in underground means for a lower price than they would otherwise. And the oil, therefore, gets into the supply anyway, even if it's not in the official numbers. And I think this is going to be the same thing with these grains. Sure, Russia may not sell the grains directly to the U.S.'s allies, but they'll sell it to China. They'll sell it to India. They'll sell it to other non-aligned countries in this conflict. And since those countries will be able to buy the Russian grain at a discount, what was previously being sold, exports, say, from the United States and South America, that were being sold to those countries would be sold in other places to make up for it. And let's look at the global grain production as a whole. And according to Statista, which I will show this chart in the description, a link to it, and also probably show it in this video. Grain production really between 2008 and 2021 is constant. It's about 2.2 billion metric tons. It's been at the highest was 2014 and 15 when we got up to 2.5 billion tons of grains produced, and it came off quite a bit since then due to commodity prices just falling through the floor, and therefore farmers cutting back and not growing as much. If there is this, let's say for Ukraine, for example, they're about, again, 25% of wheat and 13% of corn exports come from Russia and Ukraine combined. But since a lot of that is used domestically, their entire production is not coming off the map. So let's just say it's probably much lower than this, but the worst case scenario, say it's half of that. So you're going to lose, say, a total of 10% of the grain market internationally. And so therefore grain drops from 2.2 trillion metric tons to 2. As seen with previous years in the grain market in 2013 and 2014, you can get grain production back up to those levels by the rest of the world making up for it. We can see increased crops in Brazil. And you see, look at what's going on with Brazil's currency and stock market. It's done pretty well because they're the geopolitically safe replacement source for a lot of the commodity exports previously to Russia. You can have increased production, obviously, in the United States. Like Kansas has been tearing down a lot of its wheat fields and replacing them with growing cotton. But if wheat prices get high enough, they could switch back. But cotton's pretty high too, so maybe not. But there are places where more or less that more expensive to grow crops, the lower margin crops, will be swapped out for higher margin crops because these grains are trading at higher prices. On top, and so that's where I think there's plenty of room to catch up. That will lag a little bit, but we have enough supply that they're not going in reserve, that the world's not going to run out of food in less than 6 months, and that's what it would need to take to have a global grain shortage. There is a risk, though, in some of these poorer countries, the price of food will rise beyond the level of affordability. Like food spending in Western countries is anywhere from 3 to 10% of income. So if you see a 20 or 30% increase in food, yeah, you may not have as much money, disposable income, and that does hurt the economy, but it's not enough that people are going to like starve. Whereas in the emerging world, food is anywhere from 20 to 50% of a monthly budget in many poorer countries in the world. And because of that, if you have food prices go up 20 or 30%, that basically eats away all of your disposable income and possibly just your ability to survive for keeping a roof over your head. That's why the Arab Spring, at least half the reason why things such as the Arab Spring took place during the last big grain spike from, say, 2010 to 2012. The Middle Eastern lower classes could not afford to buy food, and therefore they took it out against the government. But the underrated variable, though, for revolutions is not just food. Because, yeah, the people could get angry, but if you don't have the coordinated leadership to mobilize these people in a way to do real damage to the state, it's hard for a revolution to succeed. And usually those people who've done that historically are the precariat class, which are those who are highly educated but underemployed. And the Arab Spring, the Middle East had plenty of people like that. They had increased rates of young people going to college, but once they graduated, there weren't that many college-level jobs. And so that created a lot of resentment and dissatisfaction. Same thing happened with Russia in 1917. A lot of the Bolsheviks were recent college graduates, but were not able to find or unwilling to find employment that could that justify the perceived status boost and they claimed to have by going to college. Well, I'll talk about the role of education and overemployment and underemployment by education and what that means for a social political sense, maybe in a future video, because it is economics related. But the thing is that is an equal variable to what drives revolutions, as well as a shortage in grain. But the bottom line really is 10 to 20% of corn production is sold overseas. 50% of wheat and soybeans are sold overseas in exports. So if the U.S. really wanted to make sure there's plenty of food and that the reserve did drop, they can just stop the exports and there'd be a glut of food overnight, or just allocate less of it to things like ethanol and industrial uses and more towards food. I think that this whole movement of pitching an end-of-the-world style food crisis is intellectually and borderline morally irresponsible, and I think its more goal is to foment political dissatisfaction for ideological reasons and to get people riled up and panic more than being actually helpful. Let me know your thoughts on this. Please like and subscribe. And don't worry, the grocery stores are not going to run out of food all of a sudden. At least in the United States and most developed countries, there's plenty of food. It's probably going to be more expensive to go out to eat in the future until the grain balances are normalized within the next year or two. But in the long run, things will be fine when it comes to food. Food and grain and agriculture exports are one of the biggest strengths of the United States as a whole, and it's why America is such a powerful country, because we literally feed the world. It may be a little bit tougher in some of the more emerging economies where food is a much bigger portion of people's budget And we've seen how that affects places in the last big grain spike about a decade ago. But overall, yeah, there's plenty of grain in the world. There's plenty of food in the world, even with the disruptions in Ukraine. And there's no need to panic.